Welcome back to part 3 of the Building Simple Network Topologies tutorial. In our last tutorial, we spent quite some time building this topology in NS3, and we talked a bit about node containers, net device containers, IPv4 interface containers, and we talked about indexing within these node containers and the net device containers and interface containers. But what about indexing within the entire NS3 simulation? So what would be the index of this node, or let's say that node, which is router 3, or workstation 2, or for instance this node? How do we determine the index of the nodes within our simulation? Also, how do we determine the index of our devices on a particular node? And how do we determine the indexing for our IPv4 interfaces and the addresses on those interfaces? So how do we determine what IP address was actually assigned to a particular net device? So that is the purpose of this tutorial, to try to help us or help you to understand how the nodes, the net devices, and so forth are indexed in NS3. So in NS3, there's something that is called the node list, and basically it says here that every node created in this simulation is added to this list. So every time you create a node, it's injected into the node list, and the nodes are added in the order that they were created. Now this is very, very important, because if you don't understand that concept, you're not going to be able to understand which node has a particular index within the NS3 simulation. And when we get to later tutorials, for instance, that deal with things like tracing and naming and so forth, especially when we get to probably our next tutorial or two, when we look at how we configure our network, we are going to have to know how the nodes are indexed in the simulation. So bear in mind that all nodes are added to the simulation, are added to the node list within the simulation, as well as the nodes are added in the order that they were created. So in the code that we created in the previous tutorial, I've taken out a snippet of that code, and we can see that we have 3 node containers that were created, right? And then we created the nodes just a little bit lower down. So you notice that there's a particular order. We had the host node container being created first, and there was 1 node created in that node container. We then had the routers node container being created, and we had 4 nodes being created and added to that node container. And then we had the branch node container created, and we had 3 nodes added to that node container. So if we look at this diagram here, it helps us to appreciate basically what the node list would look like if we were to draw it out. So it helps us to conceptualize it. So again, we see the 3 node containers in the order in which they were actually created. So we had the host node container, we have the routers node container, and we have the branch node container. So you notice how within each node container there's an indexing scheme that we were talking about in the previous tutorial. So remember when we were adding the different routers to subnet 1, subnet 2, subnet 3, subnet 4, and so on, we had the different indices here. Well, that's within the different containers themselves. Alright. The node list is looking at the indexing for the nodes within the entire simulation. So when we created the first node container, which was host, and we used the create method to create 1 node, that node was injected into here, and it would be injected into the node list at an index of 0. Then when we created the next node container, which was routers, and we used the create method to create the 4 nodes inside of that node container, those 4 nodes would be added to the node list, and therefore router 0 would be added at node list 1, routers 1 would be added at node list 2, routers 2 would be added at node list 3, routers 3 would be added at node list number 4. And lastly, when we added the branch node container, we had 3 nodes in that node container, and they as well would be added to the node list. So it would be added at index 5, index 6, index 7 respectively. So if I wanted to actually find out what index a particular node would be, I will have to know the order in which I created them. And that's basically, if you want on a piece of scrap paper, just draw out something like this. After a while you can do it in your head basically, but just to make sure you have it down, you could draw out a little diagram like this, and what node containers you created and the order in which they were created, and then you can index each one starting from 0 all the way to the last one. So if I go back in my diagram a little bit, so we can see here, for instance, workstation number 2, and this is in the branch node container. And of course, just like when we did with the routers, we had the convention that router 1 was the first one in the node container, router 2, router 3, and router 4, and so forth. You'll have to decide which one of these nodes in the node container is at index 0 in that node container. So let's say the convention is that we've decided that the file server is going to be at index 0 within the branch node container. It then means then that branch 0 is going to be the file server, and that file server, in the grand scheme of things of the entire simulation, is going to be at an index 5 in the node list. And when we get to our tutorial on configuration, where we actually have to configure individual nodes or devices, we want to be able to identify which particular node we are dealing with when we are actually doing configuration. So think about this for a little bit. Understand that we're going to be adding nodes in our simulation in node containers, and it's important to understand that the order of the node containers is important. Feel free to draw out a simple diagram like this. Put each node container that you have with the number of nodes in it. If you have to decide on a convention of which node is which, in our case we took router 1 to be the first node in the router's node container, and we took the file server to be the first node in our branch node container. So therefore it means then that the workstation number 2 will be branch 1 and the printer will be branch number 2. Once you choose a particular convention, you need to stick with it throughout your simulation. You probably need to document that somewhere, because you may come back and forget that a particular node that you have named within your network diagram is a particular node within a particular node container, and therefore you then would get confused as to where it would be within the entire simulation. Alright, so this is a brief introduction to the node list. Of course, if you want to see the documentation in node list itself, you can actually go to the Doxygen. It's here already. It's right next to node container, and you can see that there are functions to add and get the node and so on. But we don't really interact with a node list directly. The simulation itself actually does these things for us. All right, we will show you how to actually use the node list at a later time. But for now, we want you to think about what we just discussed. Take some time. If you need to pause the video, take some time, go over it a little bit, and really absorb yourself in this, because it's a very, very, very important concept. I can't stress how important it is to understand node indexing in NS3. Let's talk a little bit about device indexing. And when we talk about device indexing here, we are not talking about the indexing within a net device container. We are looking at the indexing of the net devices that have been installed on a particular node. Now, you would remember that earlier I mentioned that there was a loopback net device that would be installed on a node? Well, it's done automatically for us at the time of the creation of the node, and it has a device index of 0. So basically it provides a loopback interface that is similar to what you would find on the network interface card of your personal computer. So if I had a node, the very first net device that I install would have an index of 1, and that's because the loopback device would be at an index of 0. Of course, we would expect that the second net device that I would install on a particular node would then have an index of 2. So for any node, the indices associated with its net devices is determined by the order in which devices are installed on the node. And again, I stress that that is an important statement, because you must be able to determine the order in which the net devices was created in order to know what index it would be in the device list. And we already know that the loopback net device is at index 0, and of course all the other devices afterwards would be starting from an index of 1. So if we look at our devices for router 2, we can see here that the loopback net device is indeed at index 0, so it would be at device list 0. The first point-to-point net device would be at index 1, the second one would be at index 2, the third would be at index 3, and we can see how it's referenced here using the device list. So if I look at the diagram here, I can see router 2, and I can see we have the first net device, the second net device, and the third net device. And we can see that the order is corresponding, of course, to how they were created. Because we know when we created this simple network here, we created subnet 1, subnet 2, subnet 3, subnet 4, and then subnet 5. So we know we would have created subnet 1, and somewhere in the code we would have a line like this. This is actually from the code itself, where we use the point-to-point helper to install point-to-point net devices on subnet 2. So this net device container would have 2 point-to-point net devices in it. One would have been for this guy here, router 1, and another one would be here. So that is why this particular net device here is at an index of 1. It would be the first one that we install on the node router 2. Similarly, if we look at line 76 in our code, it may be a little bit different for you depending on how you typed it in, but we can see here when we install the point-to-point net devices on subnet 3, which is this subnet here, that would have been the second point-to-point net device we would have placed on router 2. So it would be at device list 2. Similarly here, for the code on line number 92, we install point-to-point net devices on subnet 4, which is here, and therefore that would be the third net device that would be installed on that node. So interface addressing. Yeah, I know you're probably confused by now, aren't you? I could just see the expression on your faces. But anyway, I hope that as you go through the material a few times, you would be able to have a good understanding of device and node addressing, and hopefully fully understand interface addressing as well. When I was thinking about presenting this slide, I was really wondering what's the best way to explain this to you. But anyway, I'll try my best. So let's start off first by looking at the diagram. It's basically a replica of what we would have created in the previous tutorial. We are looking here in particularly at subnet 1, which we know has 2 nodes involved in this point-to-point link. We have workstation 1 and router 1, and we also can see from the code that I have included from the NS3 script that we wrote that we created a subnet 1 node container, and we would have added 2 nodes to it. We would have added first workstation 1, and then we would have added router 1. So you can see that workstation 1 would be at index 0 in the node container, and router 1 would be at index 1 in the node container. And that should be no strange news to us. We should be fully comfortable with that. But remember now that when we actually wanted to install net devices on the nodes within this particular node container, or on this subnet here, we would have passed that node container to the install method of the point-to-point helper, and it would return a node container that contained the net devices that were associated with the nodes within that particular node container. So we should not be surprised then to see that workstation 1's net device would actually be at index 0, because it appears first within the node container, and router 1 net device would appear at index 1 in the device container, that is subnet 1 devices. You also notice that I've indicated here that that net device is actually at an index 1 on the node itself, because remember, each of these would have a loopback net device that was automatically installed, and since this is the first net device that's installed on these nodes, they both would be at index 1 on their respective nodes. So that is the device container, and you can see that the order again of the devices within that container corresponds to the order in which the nodes were in the node container. So then when we proceeded to actually go ahead and create our addressing scheme, and then we took the subnet 1 device container, we pass it into the assign method of the IPv4 address container, and it would have assigned IPv4 addresses to the interfaces on those net devices and return that container to us. So here we have that container, and again you can see that we have the first net device, which actually belongs to the first node, which is this one here, workstation 1, and the second interface actually belongs to this net device, which is for router 1. So we can see here that again the order in which they appear within the IPv4 interface container is the same as the order in which they appeared in the device container, which again is the same order they appeared within the node container. So what am I really saying then? What I'm saying to you is that for you to determine what IP addresses appeared at these two nodes, the interfaces for these two nodes, you have to understand and know what is the order in which they appeared within the particular node container. And again, that's why I said to you earlier, you have to devise a convention as to which node that you have named here is at which index. Because if I decided, well, I wanted router 1 to be at index 0, and therefore wanted it to get the IP address of 10.1.1 instead of 10.1.2, I would actually have to swap these two lines here. I have to move this up 1 and bring this down 1, so that when I do the addition into the node container, router 1 would end up here at index 0, and workstation 1 would end up at index 1, and therefore when I add them, when I install the net devices, router 1 would be the first net device, and therefore when I assign up IP addresses to the interface will be created here first on router 1's net device, and it will have an IP address of 10.1.1.1. Are you confused? I hope not. Again, all you have to do is understand the order in which your nodes appear within your node container, and simply track that order all the way down to when it creates the IPv4 interfaces. So whichever node came first in your node container here that guy is going to get the first address, the second one, second address, and so forth. And it's as simple as that. So I hope this tutorial has been informative to you, and I hope that you are still willing to continue along the path of NS3 programming, and I hope to see you in the next tutorial.